All right, so welcome to this conversation discussion that myself and Dustin are going to be having. Now, before I let Dustin sort of introduce himself, say where he's coming from, I just wanted to give a bit of context to people to how we got into contact with each other. On formerly Twitter, now known as X, I don't know how long it's going to be until people stop referencing the fact it used to be Twitter, but we haven't got there yet. So on X, as many people who are watching will know, it was bought by Elon Musk, and Elon Musk is also a big proponent of pro-natalism, and he occasionally tweets about this topic. He doesn't tweet about it a massive amount, but he occasionally tweets about it. And one of the tweets he put out somewhat recently was, "The real battle is between the extinctionists and the humanists. Once you see it, you can't unsee it." Dustin then replied to that. I replied to Dustin, and we had a bit of a back and forth, and then we agreed, like, let's just have a conversation on voice. So that's how it came around. And yeah, I'll let Dustin, do you want to sort of introduce yourself, let us know, where you're coming from, all that sort of stuff, and we can go from there.
I like it. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Lawrence. So I'm a dad. I have a 3-year-old. So 4 friends, we all do a podcast together on fatherhood. Our goal is to be better fathers, to raise the next generation a little better than we were. I didn't have a dad around. For me, it's super important to be as good of a father as I can. I've been familiar with antinatalism for a number of years. I find the concept fascinating. And given that my worldview, I understand it, is antithetical to your worldview, I thought it'd be really interesting to have this conversation and see where we can find common ground. If we can't, how we keep it civil, and still, try to be friends as much as possible, and kind of go that direction.
Yeah, 100%. And to be honest, I think a lot of people I speak to about this topic are surprised at how much common ground there is. Maybe not in terms of the fundamental either rejection or acceptance of procreation, but the stuff around that, the things we care about, tend to overlap quite a lot. And just to give one example, you sent me over your podcast, and I had to listen to 2 of the episodes. The first 2 ever ones, there was your intro one, and then the one on psychology of money, which I think you led.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I found the psychology of money one super interesting because I'm really big into personal finance. And actually, literally the day before, I'd been listening to an interview about the psychology of money with Morgan. I forget his second name.
Housel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed listening to your podcast. And actually, it may be surprising to you, but I actually think it's a very good initiative. So this maybe, act as a bit of a segue for me just to explain where I'm coming from with antinatalism, basically.
Great. Yeah.
So the reason I think your podcast is a good initiative is because whilst I don't think that people should be bringing new individuals into the world, I recognize that people are going to do that. And given that people are going to do that, I think those individuals should be given the best shot that they can at the life that they're going to have. And I think part of that is responsible parenting. So, I mean, even though obviously it depends on the antinatalist, but even though antinatalists are seen as very anti-parent, and there is a lot of anti-parent discourse, or a lot of anti-parent sort of themes in antinatalism, I don't see it as inherently anti-parent. There are many antinatalist parents. There are many people who are parents and become antinatalist after having had children because, you can't really help when you come into contact with an idea. There are also antinatalists who have adopted children because for me and for many antinatalists, it's about not creating another person. That doesn't mean you can't adopt someone. There are many antinatalists who actually still want to raise a child. They just are ethically against creating them. So they maybe opt for the adoptive option, or maybe that feeling over time fades out a bit. So they then opt not to raise a child anyway. But yeah, that's why I think your podcast is a good initiative, because I also recognize that, particularly in the Western world, which is the place I also am, there is a dearth of support behind fathers and encouragement of fathers. And whilst, again, I think people should not be having children in terms of biological children, if they are going to have children, I think it's good that podcasts like yours are out there, because if they are going to have kids, they better be as equipped as possible. And I think your podcast helps to cultivate a culture of more responsible parenthood, if parenthood is going to be happening.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I'm with you. I think if someone is not equipped emotionally or in some other way, if they're mentally unstable, if they have just terrible finances, there's a number of reasons that it's not a great option to have children if you're not ready for it. So I certainly am not pro-natalist in the sense that everyone should procreate as much as possible at all times. I certainly don't think that's a good idea. I believe that birth control is generally a good thing to be able to plan your family, all those kinds of things. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, 100%. And again, that's something that you and many antinatalists will be on board with, about access to contraception and family planning and stuff like that. So if I'm to, again, I'll just lay out a bit more about what I personally mean by antinatalism, and then please you go into what your thoughts are on that, because you said that you've been aware of it for some time now. And you also brought some sort of points of conversation that you wanted to go over. So after I've sort of laid it out, I'll let you sort of take the floor, and you can take us forward. So the way I see antinatalism, like I said before, it's not a rejection of parenthood inherently. It's a rejection of creating new life, which obviously creating a new person is the primary way that people achieve parenthood, for obvious reasons. But I don't think antinatalism is an inherent rejection of parenthood. And so why do antinatalists reject the creation of new life? Again, it's going to depend on the antinatalist you talk to. But for me, it comes down to a few key aspects of the act of bringing someone into existence. So the first one is that I don't think we have an obligation to bring people into the world that we know would have a happy life. I think if someone does exist, obviously it's good for them to have a happy life. Like me and you, we both exist. It's great for us to have happy lives. But like, I have one sibling. I don't cry over the fact that I don't have a third sibling. I don't think it's wrong that they didn't come into the world to have a happy life. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, I do think we have an obligation and a duty not to create people who we know will have bad lives. So that, I think this is generally quite widely accepted that if a couple goes to a doctor and finds out they have some sort of hereditary disease, then that's going to cause their child, a lot of pain. By and large, even non-antinatalists will say that that couple should choose not to have that child. That would be a wrongful imposition on that child. And so to me, what that says is, if we don't have anything compelling us to bring happiness or well-being or anything into the world via a new person, but we do have something telling us not to bring this suffering about it via a new person, that to me says that if we put those two things together, overall we should opt on the side of not creating someone. Another part of it is that the suffering that you will put on someone when you create them, and the guarantee of death, obviously, because obviously everyone at the end of their life dies, all of that is done without the consent of the person. You can't gain consent from someone. And generally, in basically any other ethical situation we can think of, if you are going to impose some suffering on someone, and they are not in immediate danger of greater harm, if you can't get consent to do an act to them, to impose that suffering on them, then you shouldn't do that. And the last one is just that when you do bring someone into existence, even if you do see bringing a generally happy person into existence as good, there's no guarantee they're not going to be one of those people who has an awful life. Like, we all know celebrities who have all the money, you can have all the resources available to them, and they can still have supremely bad lives. And It's just the completely unnecessary risk to take on someone else's behalf that they may fall into that category of person. So yeah, I think that's sort of laid out generally what I mean by antinatalism. But please, yeah, go ahead.
Great. So yeah, let's take a couple specific examples there. So was my choice to have my child unethical by the standard of antinatalism?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know your exact circumstances, obviously, but assuming that you're just a general member of society and you completely freely chose, there was no coercion in your situation, then yeah, I would say it would be better for the child you did create if they weren't to have come into existence. And I think it was a morally problematic decision for you to make, in my opinion.
Right. Then yeah, I think our worldviews are totally antithetical in that regard, and yeah, I just want to make that clear. So a couple of the arguments you made comes down to suffering as the big one, right? And so I look at Viktor Frankl, for example, in Man's Search for Meaning. Right. This is a man who went through concentration camps, had the worst possible things happen to him imaginable, and he went through all of that and found purpose in his life. And so I think our greatest thinkers, especially from a humanist perspective, find that pain and suffering are not really relevant to the overall span of someone's life. And in fact, in many cases, I'm reading Arnold Schwarzenegger's book right now, and it's
really?
absolutely fantastic. Yeah, and he talks a lot about pain and suffering as his greatest assets, how they're wonderful things for him, and how if he'd had an easier life, we would not be reading his book today. His father was cruel to him in many ways. He beat him when he was drunk. He was a good man when he could be, but he was also a very harsh man. He was literally a Nazi. He was German army. So, to go through that, you would think, okay, Arnold Schwarzenegger was probably going to lead a terrible life and be very unhappy and miserable. And yet he's one of the happiest, most fulfilled people that you'll meet. And so I think focusing on suffering as the key component of whether someone is happy or will experience joy in their life is missing the forest for the trees. And I'm not sure how you'd respond to that.
No, so I agree with you and disagree with you. So once someone exists, I agree with you that suffering can lead to character. It can lead to, very meaningful experiences for people. And often people elect to voluntarily pursue some form of suffering for a greater benefit. So, the classic example is going to the gym, short-term suffering, but for a long-term gain of building strength, building, not motivation, but building, discipline, etc., etc.
Building the muscle.
So, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I 100% agree with you on that front, that once we're here, we shouldn't live in a way where we seek to just avoid all suffering. I think that would actually lead to a worse life. But I think that applies to people who already exist. There's a difference between someone who already exists and someone who doesn't exist. So it makes sense to me to pursue some suffering because it will have an instrumental benefit. But it doesn't make sense to me to create someone so that they can benefit from the instrumental value of suffering. So, for example, it makes sense for me to go to the gym to build strength in the long run because that will benefit me. But it doesn't make sense for me to say I'm going to have a kid so they can go to the gym so they can build muscle because it will benefit them long term. Because the only reason they needed that value, that benefit in the first place is because I created them. The second thing I would say is that not everyone can capitalize on the benefits or certain benefits of suffering. So someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger may be able to capitalize on that form of suffering because he has a certain mindset or he has certain capacities. Not everyone can do that. For some people, it will ruin them, the experiences he had. For many people, I think probably one of the reasons he stands out is perhaps because he was able to capitalize on it. Whereas many other people, you don't hear about them because they would just wither and die and need therapy from that sort of stuff. And also there are other people, maybe people with like learning difficulties who simply wouldn't have the intellectual capacity to be able to um, to contextualize that suffering in the same way. So I think, and again, when you have a kid, you don't know if your kid is going to fall into any of those categories. So for me, to round up, I agree with you that when we're here, we shouldn't live in a way where we avoid suffering at all costs. It can be beneficial to us in some ways, but I don't think that's a reason to create someone, and not everyone can do that.
Sure, that's fair. But if our concern is that we need to prevent suffering by not having a child, then aren't we potentially preventing that same child from having a great life? Right. So yes, you're not having the child so they won't suffer, but you're also not
Mm.
allowing a new life to potentially have joy and experience happiness.
Yeah, so I think there's a few words I would pick up on there, like the word allow. Allow, it implies that there is someone already there wanting to have this quote unquote good life, and if only we were to get out the way or open the door, then they would be able to have that. But there simply is no one who exists to want the happy life before we create them. And so if we don't create someone who would otherwise have had a happy life, there's no deprivation, there's no harm done. It's a bit like in, you know, how me and you, we exist now, but neither of us existed in like the year 1400. And we didn't miss out on the year 1400. Like, we just didn't care. We didn't exist in any way to even, you know, if someone asked you what was the year 1400 like for you, it just wouldn't make sense as a question because we didn't exist then.
Mm-hmm.
And so future people who I could create, that's the case for them now. Like, they just simply don't exist for them to be harmed or deprived in any way from me not creating them, if you get what I mean.
Sure. Yeah, but you also there's no one to suffer at that point either. So it's this I don't know, when it comes down to consent is a relatively new concept, and it typically applies to adults. I mean, everything I've done
Yeah.
with and to my son over the past 3 years was done without his consent. He doesn't know how to. He has
Yes.
no reason. Dawns about the age of 7. And so everything he does, including making messes and generally being a pain in the butt when he wants to, is it's not about consent. Every time I wipe his butt after he poops or any of that kind of stuff, you know, that's all non-consensual. So it's hard to talk about consent for someone, one, who doesn't exist, or two, doesn't know how to consent. You know, for example, it's the same challenge you as a vegan. You know, if I were to eat some chicken that can't consent to being eaten, but it also doesn't understand what's happening to it. And so there's this interesting line of where that changes. And I think for humans, it's around the age of 7 for most people as to when they can start to consent. They start to understand what's happening to them. And so it's very hard to have this conversation of suffering versus joy as to whether you're robbing an opportunity or whether you're preventing harm. And so to take it another direction, antinatalism to me strikes me as a very individualistic idea, right? We're trying to prevent one person from suffering. But other cultures are more collectivist in nature. So they would look at the benefit of the whole against the potential harm to one. So for example, a more collectivist organization like the Chinese government might say, if Dustin and Lawrence have to die so that a beautiful building can be built, so be it. It's for the greater good. And so as you and I are both individualists, we both come from Western culture, we would say that's not good. I don't think the two of us should die so that a building can be built. I would consider that unethical. But as so much of humanity is more about the greater good, it's interesting to look at it and say, okay, if some amount of suffering has to occur so that the beautiful things that humanity has done can continue, that has value as well. And I'm curious how you would respond to that.
Yeah, well, just quickly on the Chinese government example, I actually think we do that all the time in the West as well. So you use the example of, like, you know, killing 2 people to build a magnificent building. We do the same thing in the West all the time, and I'm not saying the West and China are the same. I'm not, you know, I'm not like a fan of the Chinese government or anything like that. But we do it all the time in the West as well. So one classic example is driving, right? Like, we all participate in driving, but we all know that every year there's a certain amount of people who are going to be killed as a result of that in traffic accidents. So we all implicitly sort of condone that when we participate in driving, as we do, you know, every day or every other day or however often people drive. So I do agree with you that the individual is the morally relevant is the morally relevant uh, party when it comes to ethics.
Mhm.
Like, I don't think we should be looking at ethics from looking at a whole species or a whole population or something like that. It's the individual who is the one that can be harmed and benefited and suffer and feel happiness. So I agree with you. I think the individual is the morally sovereign party. But I just wanted to point out there that we do make these decisions all the time, even in the West. The other thing I wanted to touch on was the first thing you said about consent. I do agree that obviously, like when you're raising a child, it is completely impractical and impossible to be able to raise them without essentially consenting to things for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the reason that I see that as different when you do that for an existing child than for a child who doesn't, or an individual who doesn't exist, who you're sort of considering whether to create, is because the decisions that a parent makes for their existing child, where they need to consent by proxy, those decisions usually will be in the interest of the child. And if they impose some harm on the child, it is so that the child will avoid a greater harm. So, a good example is when you get your children to take medication. They probably won't like to do that. And so that is a small, uncomfortable feeling for them. But you have their interests in mind, and you know that doing that will mean that they're going to avoid a greater harm, getting ill or getting worse
Mm-hmm.
in their illness or something like that. The example is, as you used as well, of wiping your son's bum. If you didn't do that, then obviously, eventually he would get an infection somewhere on his body. So again, you're staving off like a greater harm. But when it comes to creating someone, there is no harm that they can come to because they don't exist. And so to me, to like to create them and consent on their behalf doesn't make sense to me, because you're imposing a harm on them for to avoid for them to avoid no greater harm, because they don't exist to be able
So
to be
the
harmed.
challenge there, though, is
Sorry.
there's an implicit assumption there that the child will be harmed by being born. And again,
Well,
there's no way we can
yeah,
know whether we're harming the child or whether we're helping them by them being born. So I think that's my fundamental misunderstanding of the philosophy,
mm,
is that the assumption of antinatalism is that by being born, the child is being harmed, and that's
yeah, and yeah,
it's odd to have such a negative view of life. Especially, I mean, it sounds like you grew up a pretty happy person. You didn't have
yeah,
anything
yeah,
particularly
yeah.
bad happen to you. So what was
No,
the
no.
point in your life where you decided, despite my life being pretty happy,
Mm.
I don't believe it's ethical for other people to have children? I'm curious what brought you to that viewpoint.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no. So you're right. For me, I had a very pleasant upbringing. I was raised in a situation where I basically had everything that I needed. I didn't have like a Ford Mustang when I was 7 years old or anything, but I had all the reasonable sort of necessities of life and stuff. I grew up in London, a mega city, and all this sort of stuff.
Mhm.
So yeah, I had a very good and attentive childhood and stuff. I came across this idea when I was 20 years old. I actually just overheard a conversation where someone was talking about it. And then I'd heard the word at that point. And then a couple months later, the topic came up again in a different environment. And because I'd heard the word, and at this point, I didn't agree with it at all. I at that point, I wanted three children. I was very much on the sort of gravy train of, um, you know, I basically centered my life around wanting kids at that point, like many people do. It's just something I picked up from the background culture, and maybe it was also just like a inbuilt desire as well. So when I first heard the idea, I also thought it was quite bizarre. Um, and then, yeah, like I said, it came up in another context, and I sat down with three people who I knew to some degree. and they all happened to be anti-natalists. I had no idea at the time that they were, but when the topic came up, I started to ask them about it. I learned that they were anti-natalists, and basically they just explained it to me and sent me away with a few links to interviews to watch on it. And I asked them all the questions that I wanted to, and all the replies they gave me seemed to knock down the things I was saying. And I couldn't find any good argument against what they were saying. And I since haven't come across a sorry, the connection just dropped, but it's back there.
Okay, great.
I since haven't come across a good argument, or what I feel is a good argument against it either. So I then just came to accept it. And there was a bit of discord there at the start, obviously, because I still had an emotional attachment to the idea of wanting to have a child. But that emotional attachment did fade over time, to the point where now I would be open to adoption in some circumstances, but it isn't the main sort of goal of my life anymore. But yeah, that's how I came about it. I just had a conversation with these three people, and eventually got to the point where I was like, well, I can't come up with any good rebuttal to this personally, so I had to take it on board. And yeah, it like for me, it didn't come from any emotional place. Like, I have a very good life day to day. I'm, I generally, I'm like day to day, I'm quite like an optimistic person, or this sort of stuff. But yeah, for me, fundamentally, I just I see no reason concerning the individual I could create. I see no reason to create them, but I see reasons not to create them. And when you were saying about it's a negative way to see it as coming into existence as a harm, the reason that antinatalists see it that way is because when you do create someone, you are imposing a significant amount of harm on them. Whether someone likes it or not, like, we all suffer in our lives to some degree. We lose our parents, we have illnesses, eventually we die. Obviously, that's a great harm. There are some philosophers who think death isn't a harm, but by and large, people do think death is a harm. Um, there are many ways people are harmed in their lives, and that's the harm that antinatalists are pointing at.
But if not being born is not a harm, then how is dying a harm? Aside from the suffering, I mean, you die. It takes 1 second to die. It sucks, but then there's nothing after that. So is it just that moment of death that's the harm?
So obviously, there's two different things. There's death, and there's dying. So obviously, dying can be horrible for people. People die in all sorts of ways, through cancer or
So hypothetically,
warfare.
let's say you get hit by a bus, you don't suffer. You're dead.
Yeah, yeah. So again, it really depends on the person you ask. For me, for me, it's still a topic I'm thinking about. I still see death as a harm, because I think there's two different situations. So if I compare it to bringing someone into existence, if I don't have a kid, I don't see that as the same as killing someone. And the reason I don't is because if I don't have a kid, there was simply no one who existed, and I just chose not to create anyone. So there was no individual who had a desire or an interest or a need or anything that I was thwarting. But once someone exists, we have interests in certain things, we have certain needs, we have certain desires, and if you kill someone, you are thwarting all of those
Oh, not
things.
kill. Sorry, person dying. Yeah, I'm not advocating for someone killing, but to say that someone dies of natural causes. You fall off of a, you're taking a selfie because you're trying to get on the gram, and you fall off a building.
Right,
and
right.
That's it. Yeah, but no pain.
Yeah. No, so I would say it, for the same reasons, it would be a harm to them. So obviously, it wouldn't be immoral, because obviously it's an accident. It's just something that happened. You can't say that an accident is immoral, because there needs to be an agent who willed it for it to be immoral. But yeah, for them, I would say it's a harm, because their interests have been frustrated. They would have long-term goals. They have relationships that they want to maintain. They have an interest in continuing to exist, presumably. I mean, obviously, there are some people who don't have an interest in continuing to exist. Maybe someone with a long-term illness, and they are just going downhill, and maybe they would elect to be euthanized. But by and large, people have a will to continue living. They have an interest in continuing to exist, and I think that should be respected. And if they die of natural causes or someone kills them, that frustration of their interests, I would say, is a harm.
So the
Yeah,
fact that
that's
they
that's
have
my
those
personal
interests
view.
means that their life has value and purpose and meaning, right? So it seems logically
Exactly.
inconsistent to me to say that there is no harm that they never get the opportunity to have those interests and that love, but then once they have it, it's a harm that it's taken away from them. So that to me sounds logically inconsistent to say that it's different before the life versus while it's occurring. Is that so? What is the point? Is the point of, is it conception? Is it when the baby actually leaves the mother's body? What is
Mm.
the point at which now there is harm by that life being taken away? It's interesting. I think the abortion argument comes down to this as well. When is the
Yeah,
life?
yeah.
Is it at 12 weeks? Is it, the moment the sperm hits the egg? Is it only after the
Mm.
baby actually leaves the birth canal? I don't know if you can explain that better from your understanding.
Yeah, no, these are two topics that often overlap.
Yeah.
So there are the first thing to say is that there are antinatalists with a range of views on abortion. Some antinatalists are pro-life, some are pro-choice. Some
So you
actually
could be a
think that
pro-life antinatalist.
yeah. So I actually I actually had a conversation with one the other day. So the way that would work is that they would say that they believe that we should not bring people into existence, but once an individual comes into existence in a morally relevant way, which will be at some point when they're a fetus,
Mhm.
then we should be pro-life. We should protect their life because now they have an established interest in continuing to
That's
exist.
fascinating.
So
It's logically consistent. I get it now, but yeah, that's
yeah,
what a bizarre. I can't imagine walking into a cocktail party and saying I'm a pro-life antinatalist.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's because antinatalism is only concerned with coming into existence, but once someone exists, then a pro-life argument can engage. If you get what I mean.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, so the question you were asking was like, when does this happen? Like when do we count as someone coming into existence? Again, it depends on the person. For me, the only way it makes sense for me to say that someone comes into existence is when their subjective experience comes online, right? So at some point in the development of a fetus, their central nervous system and brain will have developed to such a degree where they will have a subjective experience of the world. They're not simply in the world, but they're experiencing it. They can
Mhm.
film warm or cold, whatever a fetus will experience while they're in the room. I assume they don't experience as wide a variety of things as we do once we're outside the womb, but you get what I mean. They will experience something to some degree,
Sure.
and they will have not as fully fledged interests as us. Me and you, we will have long term projects that we work on. Like you run a podcast, I do my YouTube channel.
Mhm.
We have these fully developed interests that we want to pursue in the long term. Obviously, a fetus isn't going to have those sorts of interests, but they will have some interests that we should take into account, like the avoidance of pain and stuff like that, right?
Mhm.
Which is why in some abortions, I believe anesthetic is used, right? Am I saying the word right? They're I can't say the word anesthetized when the abortion happens because they recognize that some pain could be experienced.
That's correct. Yeah.
Um, yeah, exactly. Now, obviously, people will have different views on whether that itself is ethical anyway,
Mhm.
but my view is that coming into existence happens when that subjective awareness, those interests are established, when those sorts of things come online.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That's
Yeah.
clarifying. That's a fascinating idea, and so it is logically consistent to say that you want to avoid harm. I mean, that's it sounds like what the philosophy is all about. I think the problem is that I look at it from an investing perspective.
Mm.
You can't make money if you don't risk some money. And in life,
Yeah.
it's kind of the same way. If you don't have any table stakes, if you don't actually get the opportunity to exist, you don't have the opportunity to experience joy and see the beauty of life. And so, I think my challenge with it is for an individual like yourself to make the decision not to have a child. is fine. I think it's a shame. And if you do end up adopting and you have the experience of being a father, I think you'll absolutely love it. You seem like a very warm person. But to impose that then on other people and to say, and I know you had this argument a bit with your friend who's a libertarian when you guys had that conversation. But to impose that idea on other people, to say that it is unethical for someone else to then have that child and give them that experience, I think is where the disconnect occurs. It's hard for me to see it as ethical to have that authoritarian view and say that no one outside of myself should have children. Because again, I don't think you can possibly know whether that person is going to have a good life or a bad life. And so to say that because there's a chance they might suffer means that you should not give them the opportunity to have children does not sound logically consistent to me.
Yeah, I don't see it as an authoritarian view. I think everyone everyone has opinions on how other people should behave when it comes to ethics, you know. So I'm sure both of us would say that it would be wrong for us to assault someone else, but we also believe it's wrong for other people to assault other people, if you get what I mean. So I think all of us have moral opinions or moral beliefs that we apply to other people. I think where it would become authoritarian is if I was to literally like go out and try and physically force people. I think that would then become authoritarian, and I'm not in favor of that. I think anti-natalists should pursue change in the world by one, trying to have conversations with people, trying to convince people, but also trying to help people in a way that will also align with antinatalism. So one example of that is there are many charities that are working on bringing family planning to places that are less economically developed and don't have access to that. Now, obviously, that is going to help those people, but it's also going to bring down birth rates. That is something that antinatalists can pursue that I don't think is authoritarian. I don't think it's imposing a belief on anyone else. It's simply affording people the choice of having access to contraception. So, yeah, I don't think simply having an opinion about what other people should do is authoritarian. I think if you were going to then start imposing that on people and not giving them a choice, then it would be violating their bodily autonomy. Then it would be authoritarian. And I would assume both of us would stand next to each other and oppose that. But yeah, I think having the belief itself, I don't see as authoritarian.
Sure. Yeah, it gets close to a eugenics kind of argument where you talk about, okay, well, who gets to have children, and if a child has Down syndrome, should they be aborted? If a child has, these different challenges, at what level do we say that a certain type of person doesn't have the right to exist, whereas a different other person does? And that's kind of an interesting challenge there.
Yeah, I think again, it would depend on the antinatalist, but well, actually, I don't think it would depend on the antinatalist because antinatalism is just it's an opposition to bringing any new life into existence. So we wouldn't discriminate on someone with Down syndrome or someone who doesn't have Down syndrome. So I think eugenics is slightly different. Eugenics is about trying to intentionally change the frequency of certain characteristics in a population, often associated with like race or like a superhuman or whatever. Whereas antinatalism is simply, let's just stop bringing new beings into existence, not like certain types of beings or anything like that.
But there is a de facto element to it because if a Western birth rate is 2, right, it's even lower. Japan, it's what, 1.1, 1.2. It's very low. And so you're trying to reduce birth rates in non-Western countries. You're now hoping to reduce rates of certain kinds of people's birth compared to Western, right?
Oh, right. I get what you mean. No, I think like that sort of approach. So, like the approach I was talking about before, like trying to help people get access to contraception. It's not targeting those people for who the people are. It's targeting them, one, to help them. Like I think it's a form of help. we're not saying those specific people shouldn't be having children. We're just saying those people should have access to the technology that will allow them not to have children like everyone else does, because Western people already have that. That's why that's one of the reasons why our birth rates are so low.
Sure.
So simply affording the technologies we already have to other people, I think, is simply bringing them up to the point that everyone else is at, rather than targeting them to try and say they specifically should not be having children or something like that. But I do understand. You were saying that you've been like aware of antinatalism for some time, and you're aware of like the Reddit and stuff. So there are many places online, and antinatalism does express itself mostly online. There is a large academic sort of community and environment of antinatalism, but in terms of the average person being exposed to the idea, they mostly see it through social media and stuff like that. And I will say that a lot of people do get the impression that it is associated with a form of eugenics or something like that, just because there's so much garbage on social media, and a lot of antinatalist stuff going out on social media is not healthy. I don't think it accurately portrays antinatalism. It just becomes associated with it because I think certain antinatalists who have an unhealthy way of viewing the world and to be honest, probably a poor quality of life, and so they're trying to vent. So I have sympathy for these people, but I don't think that them just having verbal diarrhea online really helps. And it also means that antinatalists in general get associated with things that we don't believe.
Yeah, I think the loudest voices that I've seen are generally people who have experienced some trauma and said that I've had a bad life,
Yeah,
so I don't think we should bring new life into the world because of my bad life. So that's what I've seen the
exactly.
most of
Yeah,
it. Yeah. So it's
yeah,
interesting talking to you
exactly.
as someone who has not had a bad life and to still
Mm.
have that idea. So why do you think the philosophy is growing so quickly? I mean, it's exploding as far as the mimetic idea. What do you think is bringing people to this idea?
Well, there's a few reasons. The first one is that we now have the internet. So before we had the internet, um, if you had antinatalist views, you would just be the one weird person in the village, that just thought differently from everyone else.
Mhm.
But now there's the internet. It's like all of the weirdos can sort of link up. And this happens for anything. You have like mums net. So mums can link, not that, mums were isolated because there were mums in every village, but you get what I mean. People are forming communities online that otherwise wouldn't have been able to be established. You have like, humanist groups online, or you have sport leagues and stuff, so people interested in a very niche sport will be able to connect with each other online. I think it's the same with antinatalism. I think people who previously were isolated have been able to connect. The spread of information is a lot easier now with the internet, so I think more people have become exposed to it. There is a subsection of society, I believe it's like, I might be getting this wrong, but I believe it's around 20% of people generally tend not to want children anyway.
It's that high. Wow.
And
Okay.
I might be wrong on the exact statistic, but it's something like 10 to 20% generally, when surveyed, don't want children anyway. They just don't have that inbuilt strong desire for that. Um, and so I think those people will probably be low hanging fruit for an antinatalist view of the world, not because they necessarily would have that view of the world, because someone can simply not want children for a whole range of reasons. They may just like going on holiday a lot or whatever, and they just don't, having a child doesn't suit their lifestyle. But antinatalism is a very specific thing, obviously, so
Yeah.
it's different from that. But the fact that someone doesn't have a child will likely make them more open to the idea because they haven't performed the act or want to perform the act that antinatalism is criticizing. And it's I think it's relatively well known that if someone is engaging in an action or wants to engage in an action that's being criticized, it's harder for them to accept
Of
the
course.
critiques.
Yeah, a church
um
that's extremely homophobic is not going to have a lot of gay members. I mean, it's
yeah,
the
yeah,
same kind of thing. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. So I think the fact that the child-free world is growing, I think the anti-natalist world is growing off the back of that. The reasons the child-free world is growing, I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, like, it's more expensive to raise a child. Women have entered the workforce, which I think has brought fertility rates down as well. There's less infant mortality. I think all of these sort of reasons have brought birth rates down. And as people have less children, the barriers for them to accept antinatalist views are probably lowered. I'm no expert on it, but that's my speculation as to maybe why it's increased.
Do you see it
I
as
don't know. Do you have any opinions on why it's increased?
I really don't. I'm curious. And so I wanted to ask you: Is it? Do you see it mostly among men, among women, among
Mm,
certain like Europeans, Americans? Obviously, anyone who's religious, I would think, would find it pretty hard to be antinatalist. Unless, well,
yeah,
although we talked about this earlier, there's certain Muslim and Christian
yeah,
sects that was it the Shakers, I think, in Pennsylvania,
yeah,
in America, and of course they died out having not having had children.
yeah,
So I think that's the other challenge with the idea is that we often pass ideas down, or we used to before the
mm,
internet, through our children, and so by not having
yeah,
children, that kind of weakens your arguments because
yeah,
you don't have converts. It's pretty easy to get your kid, well, it's not always easy, but it's easier to get your kids to believe
yeah.
things than it is people you're not connected to. um
Yeah. So the first one on like the sort of makeup of the antinatalist community. So there's been one survey of the antinatalist community, and it wasn't very big, and it was for like a small project that was like formal and had analytics and stuff like that. I don't actually know the results of that one. Um, there are, I believe, on Reddit semi-regular polls that go out asking people certain basic like identifying questions, and again, I've already said like I don't spend that much time on Reddit, but I've heard from people that the male female split is relatively balanced in those polls. What I will say though is the majority of antinatalists that people see in public and see um, trying to make a name for themselves or putting content out there or whatever tend to be men. And that could be for a whole host of reasons. Men often tend to be more confident in social situations and putting their views out there, because they are less avoidant of like conflict and stuff like that on average. It could also be that the pressure to have a child is more heavily put on women. And so women feel like they are entering they're going to have more friction if they put their views out there than men are.
yeah, I'd imagine the attacks
Um,
would be nastier against women in that situation. That makes sense.
Yeah, so I would say if you look at the antinatalist community, you probably get a feeling that there's a bias towards men, but I think it's because of those reasons, and that actually it seems from what I've heard it's relatively fairly split between the sexes. But again, it hasn't been properly formally surveyed in a large way yet.
Hmm.
So it's all kind of spitballing and speculation. Um, and hopefully it'll get more studied in the future. It'll be interesting to see like what sort of people are attracted to it.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, because ultimately, if half the population wants to have a few more kids and half the population doesn't want to have any, that actually works out.
mm,
From a
a
people who want to have kids,
population,
yeah, from a
yeah,
population perspective, if I have 5 kids and you have 0, we net out to 2.5, and that you kind of flatten out as far as
yeah,
populations go.
yeah. But then the other thing you were talking about is antinatalists. Obviously, through non-reproduction, they sort of weaken their ability to pass on their ideas
At least
to the next
historically,
generation.
yeah.
Yeah, historically. I think the situation has somewhat changed now. Um, the first thing is that antinatalists can adopt. There are, and for a long time, there will be many orphans that will need adopting. And I think it's a good thing for people to look after those children, those people. Not with the view of indoctrinating them or anything, just taking them in because it's a good thing to do. But obviously, when anyone adopts a child, they generally want to impart on that child their moral beliefs. Like when someone procreates, they want to impart their moral beliefs on a child. So if antinatalists do adopt, they would be to some degree passing their beliefs onto the next generation. The thing I will say is that it's not very common for antinatalists to adopt. There are some antinatalists who do, but it's not common enough for that to be an actually significant way of passing ideas on to the next generation. I think the significant way will be through the internet. Um, so, um, like you were saying, historically, it has been very hard to pass ideas from one generation to the next, if not through mouth to mouth teaching and procreation. But now it's becoming easier because much more information can be stored online, and it will be there for the next generation to see.
Yeah.
So I do think in terms of spreading ideas, it will be somewhat of a hindrance to antinatalists that they aren't procreating to have that aspect of it. I don't know how significant of a disadvantage that will be. And also that disadvantage, at least in my eyes, doesn't justify the act of procreating, if you get what I mean. It's not a big enough drawback to justify the immorality of the very act that you're trying to tell people not to do in the first place, if you get what I mean.
Sure. Yeah. If one person is doing something moral and everyone else disagrees, that doesn't affect the morality of it. That's fair. So a couple more questions I wanted to ask you. Do you think that the effect that humanity has had on the planet over the past 100,000 years is a beautiful and a positive one? Do you think that the buildings we've created, the societies we've created, the ideas, do you think those are beautiful, interesting, and things that have made the world more abundant? Or do you think that the harm that we've caused generally is worse than the benefits of humanity being here? So not as an individual, the suffering we have, but as the entire existence of humanity. You think it's a good thing or a bad thing? Yeah.
Yeah. So it really depends how expansive you want to be in terms of the things you're considering. But to give a general answer to your question, I think overall we have caused more harm, but I appreciate many of the things we have done. In terms of, I find them personally valuable to think about and to look at and research and stuff. So, for example, I'm really interested in history and geography. I find so many of the things humans have done really inspiring and interesting. Personally, I love digging into stuff like that, watching documentaries, all of this sort of stuff. And I do find it pretty amazing the things that humans can do when working together and what individual people can do. You know, you just have like random geniuses who just do the most insane stuff that no one else would even think to do, you know, and they push our knowledge or our technological capacities forward a whole load, just one person. So I find all that stuff personally motivating and interesting to think about. But in terms of whether we've done more harm or brought more good to the world as a species, I think we've done more harm. And the reason is that I think the worst things are much worse than the best things. So the all of the wars that have happened in the world, the millions of people that have just been butchered and massacred, tortured, you know, the bombing of Dresden, you know, the Hiroshima bomb, you know, all the 9/11, Pearl Harbor, like all of the things that have happened in the world, and then also the everyday things, like all of the sexual assault that goes on, the murder, you know, the verbal abuse, you know, the toxic relationships, all of these things added up. I don't think the good things in our lives and the good things that we've done in the world outweigh those things as it is up to the present day. Like, it would be pretty hard for anyone to think of some good things that would outweigh the harms of like the Jewish Holocaust in the Second World War, if you get what I mean. Like, I don't think anyone would really be comfortable saying, here's a list of things that I think if you total those up, it justifies, you know, the fact that our species, we just accept that happened. You know, it was sort of, you know, if we balance the things, then actually on balance, you know, it's sort of like it's fine. I think like the bad things that have happened have been much worse than the good things. And I think a lot of the harm that humans have done is actually not really recognized by a lot of people. So I think a very significant amount of the harm that we actually have done has been to other animals in factory farms, and in other ways, in laboratories and stuff like this. Like, we essentially torture and kill more animals every year than as many humans who have ever existed. So, like, that's all humans who have ever existed, and we torture and kill that many animals every year.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Um,
Factory farming's terrible. It's got to go. It's a disaster on
yeah,
so many levels. It's bad for us. It harms us, right? I mean, the chemicals from those
mm,
suffering animals harm our bodies. It's a disaster. So I
yeah,
totally agree with that. What if you
yeah,
could
yeah,
take
yeah.
that element out of it and you had the potential to, and this is total hypothetical, you can create a
Yeah.
beautiful utopian society where humans don't really suffer anymore. We mostly have a good life. And yes, historically the bad things have happened, but there is
Mm,
that. I can guarantee you that in 200 years, your great grandchild will have a
mm.
beautiful life with no suffering, and everything will be happy. What's that situation look like for you?
So for me, yeah, if human life or any life has no suffering anymore, um, I don't see an ethical issue with bringing it into the world, because the reason that I see a problem with creating a new individual is because it's me choosing to impose that suffering and the death on someone else.
Mhm.
But if those things are removed from the equation, then I wouldn't have an ethical issue with it. There
So
are a
what
few.
percentage chance would that have to be? Would 10% be enough? Would 1% be enough?
Oh no, if there was a risk that wouldn't happen, I just wouldn't take the risk.
Is your investing
Bec-
strategy like that as well? Like if there's any chance of losing money, do you?
no, no, I'm bullish on index funds. I'm bullish on index
Okay,
funds.
fair enough. All right, good. So the
Yeah, yeah.
ETF of humanity is not, you're not bullish on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Fair. Okay. Yeah.
Um, but there's a few sort of like wrinkles there, and I realize we're coming up to an hour as well, so I'll round off.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a few wrinkles there. The first one is that you were saying, like, in 200 years, I would say, even if we could get it in 200 years, the intervening generations that will endure harm, I think, is a big ethical issue, and I think that alone would mean that we shouldn't pursue it. If we had an option with just not procreating and just fading into no more individuals coming into existence, I would take that over pursuing this goal, because I know the intervening victims are going to come into existence. The other thing is that if we're just talking in hypotheticals, I would have no issue with a world without suffering. But in reality, I know that utopias are very hard to achieve, if not impossible. And if they're achieved, they can go backwards. So even if we had a world with no suffering, that doesn't mean it's guaranteed to stay that way. So in the real world, I still wouldn't bring someone into that world, because there's no guarantee it's going to stay like that, if you get what I mean.
Yeah. I think that's
Um,
logically consistent.
yeah. Yeah. Do you have anything else you wanted to go over before we round off? Or should we close off?
No, I think that's good. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well, and enjoyed our
Yeah, yeah,
conversation.
yeah. No, I enjoyed it. I I just wanted to thank you for, engaging, because a lot of people, especially on social media, um, they don't like to engage in a significant way with people. They just like to, send a few messages back and forth, um, and not take something, a bit further, like we have here. So I want to thank you for that. And also, you are always welcome to another conversation, and we can do another one if you ever have any other things related to antinatalism you want to delve into. I'm more than happy. But yeah, it's been great talking to you, Dustin.
Good. I enjoyed it. Yeah. Thanks again.